This is the Math Map Book Club, where ordinary parents encourage one another to develop an extraordinary appreciation of math. We love what we know and struggle over the unfamiliar. Through weekly conversation and exploration among friends, we can begin to enjoy ideas that seem difficult. Join our book club as we discover how math helps us to know God and to make him known.
Hello and welcome. I am Kirsty Gilpin, and Lee is otherwise engaged this afternoon, and so we will miss having her wisdom, but pray that you are in good hands with me as we take a look at some topics related to the fourth dimension. And it is May the 29th. Double check my calendar for the recording. So this is May the 29th, and I'm excited to see all of you here. So as we ask our tutors to do in community each week and our families at home, to always take a moment to look at the math map itself and know where we are on our journey. Notice that we have highlighted for the lesson pages that you currently have access to. The complex is printed, and then the digits, the naturals, and the fractions are available on CC Connected through the companion. And we are looking at the lessons in 4D, harmonics, intersecting spaces, which includes matrices, rates, rate of change, and accumulated change. And so this is perhaps some of the more challenging math, or the most unfamiliar math that we will see. And I really want to emphasize unfamiliar, because some of it actually may feel easier once it becomes familiar in terms of the computations. So as we look at those lessons today and discuss the fourth dimension, I always want to start off by giving you the opportunity to ask any questions that you have that may be lingering and you'd like to have answered before we jump into our planned conversation. I did get a message this week from somebody saying, do you really want us to ask questions? Do you really want us to be vulnerable and share things we don't know, to ask questions? And the answer is absolutely yes. There is no right or wrong use of this time. This really is designed to be an opportunity for all of you to ask us questions. And so while we may be emphasizing the fourth dimension and we may have a planned conversation, our primary goal is really to be available to you to make sure that those questions get answered. Our curriculum assistants are doing an amazing job on the forums and answering your emails that come in. And so props to Shauna and to Babs. We are so grateful to them, but we know that sometimes you may have questions that linger. And so this is the place to bring those and ask them. So I'll give you another minute in case somebody wants to jump in now. Otherwise, we'll go on to our conversation for the week.
I have a question. I can't share my video right now. I have other things happening in my background, but I've been working through the naturals with my daughter who will be going into fourth, and then with my Challenge A son, or coming up Challenge A son, he's been working on the fractions. So I'm doing them both together. And I'm just curious, I've been watching the book clubs for a while, and we try to look at each page and really just look at it before we start. But obviously my older son can move faster. And so I'm just wondering input on that, if it's for me to try to create this one room schoolhouse, if it's important for me to really try to keep them on the same page, sanity wise for me as the teacher, but also just so that what they're examining is really together. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So there's a lot of ways. So one thing we really want to emphasize is the commonality of the conversation. That if we start with the cover and talk about the art and the topic, and right, that all of our students can participate. And depending on how wide the gap between our students, that might be as much as we're able to do. And then the next thing that I would say is to look at those lesson pages, and you may look and say, okay, we're going to stay together for page 1. And now, okay, you, I think, can go and do this. So you go work on pages 5, 9, and 12, or 5, 9, and 13, while I work with your sister on these 3. So you may pick and choose and say, today we're going to work together and we're going to go at this speed, and we're going to, work on this page together, and then you can go do other things. Or today we're going to do pages 1 through 4 all together, and then tomorrow, I want you to go and see what you can do with the next, and come back if you have questions. So it doesn't necessarily every family is going to be different, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that you are entirely together that entire time, because you're right. Depending on the disparity of ages, our older students may be like, okay, I'm ready to go do this. And so being able to launch them. So having this conversation together, and then maybe launching your older student to go and do their work while you work with your younger student. Or it may be that you have that conversation and your older student maybe needs you to work with them. And so you tell your younger student, okay, I'm going to give you this direction. I want you to trace everything that's got a gray line on this page. And so it may not be that you're doing everything perfectly together, but that you can pick and choose and say, okay, we're going to work on this page top together, and now see if you can do the rest of the page on your own. Does that help?
Yes, that is so helpful. It just helps me to think of other options and ideas. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Kirsty, can I add something?
Yes.
So I was just thinking when she was talking, that really for mom's sanity is, the reason why we're kind of introducing this as a one-room schoolhouse, so that there's not 5 different topics going on at one time, right? And so I think that's the thing to think about, because she's already on the right track with what she's doing. But the simplicity of it is just that we're talking about the same concept together. And so it doesn't have to be, like you said, the entire time. But I was talking to another parent earlier this week, and she was just saying, that is the beauty. When you have 5 kids, 5 different levels, that is a lot of work for mom if she's going to be managing all those. And so to at least know that you're just talking about the same concept, helps her mindset.
That's so true. I think the hardest part is how thrilled I am at how the naturals really does help the older kids with newer concepts. And so I want to make sure and I'm trying not to teach it necessarily, but you know what I mean? It's going to take some finessing and figuring it out. But I think my biggest problem is I'm super psyched about it. So I feel like I want to address everything. So it's just figuring, like you said, share the common topic and then go from there and launch my older one.
That's great. And there is no other curriculum like the Math Map out there. And as we're looking at the increasing conversation across the country about classical education, one thing that we keep seeing is that people are like, well, there isn't really a classical math curriculum. So they're trying to adapt all these other curricula to be classical. Know that we can, right? You can take anything and approach it with a classical model. But there really isn't anything like the Math Map that was designed to be classical and designed to be used with multiple ages of students. And so it's going to take all of us a little bit of time to figure out what does that look like at home. And so I would just say, be patient with yourself as you figure that out. But that's a great question. All right, well, we'll have time at the end for more questions. So this week, one of the as we've been looking at sort of this section of the summer book club, this first go through the dimensions, we've been looking at some of the big questions that people have had. And so we talked about, what does it look like to learn math classically? How do we do that with multiple ages? How do the common topics and canons of rhetoric and core habits relate to problem solving techniques? And one of the other big questions that we've had about the charts. And so I thought we'd take a little bit of time to talk about the charts. Hopefully by now, a lot of people have been able to see these in person, because until you actually see them, Just hearing about them is a little bit hard to kind of put your hands around. But I like to think of the math map charts as being like the inset maps. So we just looked at the full map, right? And when we math map, we know that one of the things that we've said is that our dimensions are, my pen turned off, back on, that my dimensions are like the scope, and the domains are like my sequence. And so when we talk about the scope and sequence of the math map, our, sorry, I just realized that that went on the wrong slide. It moved forward. Again, right, so here we go. So here's my scope. And these are my sequence. And so the math map gives me this big map I'm going to progress through my child's math education. And it's going to give me that, I think of it as somewhat of an abbreviated scope. Here are all the topics that we're going to look at, and here's the order that we're going to move in. So that when we get here, and we look at our charts, we're now, I like to think of these as being the inset map, that if I was looking at a map in the car, in the olden days of folded maps, or if you're looking in a guidebook and you have that big map, then you'll notice that they have those sort of inset maps that are zoomed in on a particular location, right? So I might have a map of my state, North Carolina, and then there may be these inset maps that are zoomed in on the cities like Raleigh or Rocky Mount or Charlotte, to give me more detail about those areas. And that's exactly what the charts are doing, is they're giving us more insight into each of those topics. So they're sort of like a map to each of those topics. And so that really puts the grammar about that context, about that topic into context, and it fleshes out our scope and gives us the full scope. Here's all of the grammar. Here's all of the things that we're going to learn in the math map. Because we want people to be able to see that, the charts are included every single year. There is a reference. They include the words, the symbols, and images that are related to the topic. So on this page, for example, you can see we've got this image here of the Venn diagram. That's a key image when we're thinking about number notation and understanding the way that numbers are organized. We have all kinds of symbols, right? Here's all these notations. And so these notations that go along with number notation and numbers themselves, and how do we describe this? We have these different notations. Those notations, those symbols, are often what makes math more challenging. As we keep talking about the language of mathematics, that's one of the things that we keep looking at, is learning what all of these symbols mean. And then we use words, right? So what do the words digits and naturals and integers mean? What does dimension and domain mean? So we're including these key words along with definitions or descriptions of those words. So all of our charts really are predicated on that idea, giving you the grammar, the words, the symbols, and the images related to that topic into a context, so you can see which idea. And then again, it's that grammar of the language that we're looking at. And so that's how the charts really unify the domains, because as I said, it doesn't matter whether it's your natural student, your fraction student, or your complex student, they're all going to see the same charts. Now, my natural student might not use my charts very much. It might be me as the mom that goes and looks at the charts as a reference, or I might say, well, why is it that my natural student is already learning about variables, right? Why are they seeing these variables or these signs? Well, I might go and look at the chart and go, oh, because this is what we're building to. We're building towards understanding how we use literals and numerals in the math map. And so they're not actually operating on them, but they're being exposed to them so that they can become familiar. And so as a mom, I can look here at the chart to get that big picture of where the work my student is doing fits into that whole. And then I also want to point out that these charts are really our goal for our transcendental students to be familiar with. And I want to emphasize that our goal is that they would be familiar with these charts, not that they're going to master everything on the charts. Now, over time, hopefully students will master some of the things on the charts. And so I might have a student might really diagram and understand how sets or subsets of one another. But maybe the idea of what constitutes a transcendental number versus an algebraic number, maybe that's a concept that they're familiar with and they know where to go back and look up the definition, but maybe it's not something they've really mastered yet. So there's going to be things on the charts where our students might master them, but the goal is not mastery of everything on the charts because there's a lot here. But if our students are familiar with where things fit into the chart, right, they're building that that memory of not only, hey, where can I go and get, but also how those pieces slot together. And for the record, even though I'm the one that has created all of these charts, I still use the charts myself as a reference. I do not remember everything on these charts. There are times where I'm like, I don't remember that. Let me go and look it up. In fact, I was helping my daughter with her chemistry homework yesterday, and I was like, wait, let me go and get my charts because I know exactly where that information is in my charts. And I opened up my charts to chart 3.3, and I was able to read off all of the scientific prefixes. And I was like, look, it's right here in this nice orderly list, right? So I knew where to go and get the information.
She's in college, right? Your daughter.
She is in college, yes. So that was a lot that I just said. I know I tend to speak a lot. So let's pause and see if you have questions about sort of the big picture of the charts.
I don't have a question so much about the big picture, but do you have a recommendation of if there should be any portion that should be memorized? I'm just thinking about like with essentials and how students, I realize not every student is going to have every essentials chart memorized, and they are resources, and I love that. Do you have a recommendation of some specific parts that you would want children to memorize?
Sure. So and again, there's that difference between memorization and memoria, right? That what we're building is memoria, but that memoria is oftentimes built on top of some intentional memorization. One of the things that Lee has tried to do with those frame pages that we've talked about before, on that memoria and arrangement page, is to take some of that key grammar that may be worth memorizing and put it on that page. And so I think for families that are going, what should I memorize? Looking at that page may help to pull out a subset of information from the chart that is worth memorizing. Not that everything on those pages is worth memorizing, but I would say that's a better place to start. Looking at this chart, for example, let me clear my writing. If you look at this chart here, I would say things like being able to recreate that Euler diagram of the number sets. That to me is something worth practicing and something worth memorizing. I didn't want to memorize necessarily these examples of the notations, but it may be worth working through and asking my students, can they give me some examples, right? Maybe they do memorize the list of digits, but they can't memorize all of the naturals, right? But they could give me examples. And so it's a little bit of a difference, right? That you're going to have to kind of pick in as you go through what are some things that are going to always be true. That to me is worth memorizing. Right? It might be, and again, it's going to depend on the student. I mean, here, this idea of proper and improper, right? I wouldn't necessarily want to memorize the examples, but I might want to make sure that my student could recite this definition about the relationship between the numerator and the denominator.
Okay.
So does that help?
It does. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great. Any other questions about the charts in general? Babs, I like the fact that you pointed out that my daughter's in college and still finding the math map charts to be helpful, because we've actually heard that from several people that have been in the pilot or have been working with us on evaluating the curriculum, and they have those charts in a binder, and students who are in calculus and college math classes are still coming back and using those charts as a reference, because they've built that memory up. They know where things are. And so it's become a helpful reference for them, which is one of the reasons why we encourage everybody to go ahead and stick those in a binder as you use them, so that you can go back and refer to them. Things that you can do with the charts include using them as a way of tracking what you've done. So just like you were asking, right, things that I might memorize or not memorize, I could, as a mom, perhaps keep handy in a week the charts. And I'm going to use my highlighter here, right? And so maybe as I'm working through with my student, maybe I'm like, oh wow, my student's really, really strong on these early narrative, the fractions and everything. But gosh, once we got to rational numbers, like these things were really challenging. And so maybe as a mom, I just right? Highlight some things that became really hard for my students to remember, that we practiced them, but they didn't seem to stick. Well, by highlighting, right, next year I could come back and look at these charts and go, okay, hey, last year this was a hard concept. We didn't quite get this. So I maybe want to pay close attention this year and see if we pick it up. Or I could use it at my breaks or over the summer and come back and revisit and go, hey, you guys really had a hard time being able to write these ratios as fractions. Is it still hard this summer? Right. And so we can use these charts just as a way of um, keeping track, right, of assessing and keeping track of things that have gone well or things that we want to revisit. All right. So now what I thought I would do is I would take a look at a couple of charts um, and address some things that have come up through the pilot. And of those is the idea that things that we think are simple may be more complex than we thought. And so if we went back and look, I'm going to click back a couple of slides. Right here's our arithmetic. And if we have students who are going into challenge A or later, right, we might, student and myself, I've got this arithmetic thing down, and we may anticipate that those lessons are going to be simple and just reviewing the operations. So I pulled up this chart. This is chart 4.3 to show you that even though lesson 4 is primarily about addition and subtraction, that we also are introducing some big ideas here. Some ideas that include mapping. And then underneath that, we've got relation and function. That's a really big idea. It's related to addition because on the next page, we're going to talk about arithmetic sequences, which are all based on addition. So in order to understand those sequences, we want to understand this idea of iterative function. And so that's why we're introducing the idea of mapping relations and functions here on lesson 4. We also introduced this idea of limits and the one-sided limit because again, we're looking at how do we look at these sequences? What's happening to these as we keep going on, right? Is there some limit to how big they get or how small they get? And so we want to be able to use that word and we need to define it. Now, a lot of things in the arithmetic space here in our 1D we break out. So for example, if you look at significant digits down here, this is specifically for adding and subtracting. Here we went ahead and we didn't break out the laws for limits over the different operations. It just made sense to put them all here. But we're including limit laws in this discussion of limits because, again, it's going to be related to these additive functions. And so here's a case where we might be tempted to think, oh, it's just addition. But in reality, we're looking at some challenging concepts. And if they're until they become familiar, right? So while they're unfamiliar, they may trip us up. So I wanted to just talking about that so that when you are working on those lessons in 1D, you're prepared to see things that may be more unfamiliar than just operating on numbers. It also means that when we come back and we visit this lesson over and over again, right, here's a key idea why our older students are still being pushed to grow and develop in their understanding, right? Even though it may feel like we're calling this arithmetic, they're still being exposed and developing that understanding of more advanced ideas. Any questions about this or things that you think are interesting about this, or your thoughts about arithmetic being more complex than you thought?
Limits definitely threw me for a loop. So I remember going back to the naturals and tracing and copying a lot of the information about limits, and then going to the fractions and looking at what they had, and then going to, because if you don't know anything about it, I feel like I need to go all the way back to the naturals and see, okay, what would a kindergartner copy and trace? And can I learn something from that? And then I'll go to the next level we had, which was the fractions, and so I feel like I'm like teaching myself like the different ages until I get to the point where I'm comfortable going to the complex.
That's a great reminder, Babs. I love the fact that you said, right, just when it came to limits, right? I may not even have to for the whole lesson, but when I encounter something that's unfamiliar, going back and saying, okay, I'm going to work from my naturals lessons forward to build that understanding. That's a great reminder. That's one of the reasons why we've made those lessons available digitally, because we know that we're starting sort of in the middle. And so students haven't had the opportunity to move forward incrementally. And so we've made those lessons available digitally until they're available in print, right? Until students have the opportunity to come through, so that our Challenge A students and families can go back and do that process that Babs just discussed.
I actually really appreciate hearing that, because even as I know my own son and his struggles with some of the math concepts, and even my own, that even though we're in the complex level, we can back it up to even the naturals and work forward. And he'll still be able to participate in class because they're so parallel with each other. So I love that.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that great that we can have that conversation? So unlike Saxon, where, if you were in a different book or even in the same book, but just at a different speed, you're completely out of tune with the rest of your class. But here, everybody can be talking about limits at whatever level they're working in the booklets. We can still have that conversation. I discovered something new this week at church. Our music pastor is a retired like full pastor, and so I didn't know that his original degree was in math, and then he went on and got his master's in music when he was feeling a call to the ministry, and he was preaching this past week, and he talked about, right, of all things, limits, and right, how we as humans can't really understand, right, the limitless nature of God. He's like, I guarantee you, whatever image you have in your mind of God, whatever you think your God is, it's smaller than he is, right? It's small because we are finite and we live in a finite space, and everything that we do has limits to it, right? And so that idea of God being limitless is just so impossible for our minds to truly comprehend. But he went back and he was talking about math, right? And so I just love that reminder that that's one of the ways that math can help us, right? Is that when we really take a look at these mathematical limits and understand what it means to be limited or to be unlimited, right? That's giving us a glimpse, just a small glimpse of the nature of God. You know, when we look at things like this, I tell you mathematically, this is all really important because it's going to help you in calculus and it's going to help you understand the derivative, right? But at the end of the day, we all should just want to know God more. And so here, right, like Babs, you just said, right, it's not something I'd really dealt with, but have you thought about God's limitless nature and has it helped you?
Well, especially today. And then I think you mentioned it on the motherhood call.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how when you reach your limit as a mom, you know how you can relate to that. So definitely for sure. I mean, it's uncomprehendable, right? Is that a word? Incomprehensible? Yeah.
Yeah. Praise God that his love has no limits, right? That my limit with my family I may reach my limit and then behave in sinful and ungodly ways um, that can cause hurt. And praise God that my family forgives me. Praise God that he forgives me, right? And we can move on from that. But he never does, right? That his love is truly limitless and his forgiveness is limitless. And so um, he, right, as his children, he doesn't reach a point where he's just like, well, that's it. That's it. I'm walking away. Right. We saw that in the Old Testament, but praise God in the New Testament, right? He's just like, you know, um, he is always there for us. I've been listening through the Bible, um, and I was listening to Job, and it really struck me that in Esther we get this picture, right, that we aren't allowed to approach the throne, right? She wasn't allowed to approach the throne. She knew that going in and approaching the king probably meant she would be killed because she wasn't invited into his presence. And so you get this image of just the reality of what that looked like in that culture of approaching the king without invitation. And then in Job, right, so much of Job is him crying out, going, I need an intermediary. I can't go and accuse God. I can't go and talk to him. I need a mediator. And I just thought it was so beautiful, this picture of what he was talking about, right? Like I want to come to you, God, but I know that if I come and accuse you, like I can be struck dead. And then that New Testament that told to come boldly before the throne of grace. And so we see that movement in the New Testament for those of us who are the children of God, right? That there is no limit, that we can so anyway, I could kind of digress a little bit, but God is just good. And so
Hey, you made connections. That's what it's all about, right?
it is. So now let's look at a lesson from 25. And this is, or sorry, a lesson from 4D. And this is lesson 25, which is the rate of change. And this is all about differential calculus. So this is our introduction to differential calculus. And I've titled this The Complex May Be Simple because a lot of you um, may not be as familiar with calculus, right? And so it may feel foreign and it may feel hard. Even those of you who are familiar in our linear way of approaching mathematics education in the last century or so, right? Calculus has become this gateway course. It's become this pinnacle, right? Oh, try to get to calculus and then you can go and do anything. And so we up instead of something that is approachable to, to everybody, to it being something that's reserved for special people. And so I want to point out that when we look at this page, right, there's grammar to memorize, there's patterns we can recognize, and there's a topography with which we can become familiar. So I just wanted to challenge you, if you can see enough detail of this chart, what are some things on this chart, going back to that earlier question, that might be worth memorizing, might be worth using as copy work with your students?
There are lots of formulas you can memorize.
Would the top equation be something to memorize where it talks about d of y over d of x equals the f of x equals the slope?
Yeah, I think that would be a great thing to start off with.
That
Right?
top one that Kristen was referring to actually reminds me of something that we were looking at, that we were observing and tracing in naturals, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've talked about slope before. This isn't the first time we've encountered slope in the year, right? And so now, right, just by memorizing that top bar, we're defining what the derivative is for our students and perhaps for ourselves. And we're linking it back to other weeks that we've been discussing what slope means. We've talked about it on the book club, right? We've talked about slope on the book club too, because we've talked about real world examples. What are some real world examples of slope?
Well, the grade of a road while driving.
Good. Yep. Now, is that grade usually somewhat constant, or does it change a lot over time?
Depends on where you are. If you're on a mountain, it changes. A mountain, it changes. If by the beach, it stays flat.
Right. Yeah. So sometimes we can see that it's a very constant slope, right? And sometimes it may be very hilly up and down. And so there's a great conversation we could have with our kids, right? If and especially in your area, you might think about, okay, where's a place where it doesn't, right? It's whether it's flat or whether it's slowly going up or steeply going up, but it's going up at the same rate. All right, talking to your kids and going, okay, right, it's pretty constant. The slope is pretty constant, but where are some places where it changes a lot, right? And so, just in our neighborhood, for example, right, you go along and the road goes up and down. And so it changes a lot. And so, just what Kristen said, right, I need to know where I am to know what the slope is. That's what the derivative is. The derivative is just saying, okay, it's not the same everywhere. So at one point, I need to know where I am, and then I can tell you what the slope looks like, right? And so those are conversations that we can have with our younger students, right? Even though this seems like a really complex topic, right? Just talking about the definition of slope and whether it changes or not, is something we can do with all of our students, right? There's a great family discussion, right? Have everybody think about a place where the slope changes or where the slope doesn't. Yep.
So where would it be in the line? So obviously 1D, that the actual MA 1D, that the actual MA equals X plus B, that slope definition, is that back in the 1D section?
It's actually in 2D, because in 1D, there's just one line, right? So all I have is this line, and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't, without a reference, you don't know if it's what its slope is, because there's only that line. So as soon as we get into 2D, now I can always compare my line, right? So if I have my horizontal, I can always compare my line to determine if it's increasing, decreasing, or the same. And so in 2D is where we're actually going to talk about in lessons 9, and then we're going to also see it a little bit in 10. We'll refer to it in 11. We're going to be looking at that equation of a line in 18 and 17. So we're going to come back and revisit that, but in 9 and 10 is where we're going to really dig a little bit deeper into what slope is and comparing slopes.
I just found 2 of the equations in our flashcards. So that's something to, for parents, I've heard a couple parents that have some kids that look at these charts and they get overwhelmed. The kids don't necessarily have to use them. Like, we can use them as parents, and then we can give the kids the flashcards and say, well, why don't you look over these few that go with this chart and see if you can learn those.
That's great, Babs.
Are they going to be using the flashcard in class? Is that part of the tutor training?
No, that's the flashcards are really for home use. They're not really going to use those in community. In community, there's going to be more, right. It sounds so cliche, but more conversation. We're really going to try to equip the tutors to, right, how do we draw these kids out to talk about this, and talk about these ideas? And then those flashcards are really a home activity. I'm excited. And they're not going to be available for a couple of years, so I probably shouldn't get everybody else excited. But I was just working on writing, and I use writing in a somewhat loosely, the trigonometry flashcards. And I was like, oh, I wish my kids had had these, because I think they're going to be really helpful. So I think that those flashcards, and you as parents can create flashcards, right? So you can get index cards and pick some things out and be like, okay, well, we're just going to learn the derivatives for the power functions, right? And I'm just going to work through this. I will point out that on this chart here, we do everything in the general equation, which shows all the possible transformations. In chart in 30, I think it's 30. Yes, less than 30. Chart 3 has all of the parent equations, which looks at a more simplified case. So for some of your students, you may want to start off with the simplified case and then come back and add in the general equation. So there's lots of different ways that you could choose to pull that grammar out to memorize. By this point, you would have seen all of these functions before. And so your students might recognize patterns like, oh, we keep seeing these chunks of the power functions and the piecewise and the exponential logarithmic and the trig functions and the conics, right? So they may start noticing patterns in the charts, especially your older students. But we can also look for patterns within the chart, right? We might look within and say, okay, well, what are some patterns that I notice here? And then again, right, with all of our students, as they become ready to look at these charts, just noticing that topography. So, okay, well, what's on this page? The derivative. So that idea of derivative, they might go, oh, wait, I know that that's on a chart, and I'm going to go back and look at that. One of the things that we worked really hard to do is with 25 and 26, the next lesson, which is integrals, the two actually kind of overlay, and things are in the same order and in the same place. So you can see that back and forth nature between derivatives and integrals. So especially for those of you who may have older students that want to dive in a little bit more, this is a place where we can do that by looking at those charts together. So one of the questions that has come up is, okay, so, right. So one, how do I take these charts for my students who aren't ready to dive into them in depth yet and use them as a resource? But then there's also those people who are like, okay, well, my kids got big goals and I want to make sure they're ready for everything. And again, I think if you take these charts and you look at all of the grammar that we're going to be covering, hopefully that will answer some of whether a particular topic is covered. And then you can let your kids engage with these charts. Right. Some of the case studies that we've seen so far are people using these as a scavenger hunt. Right. So, hey, look at this thing in your lesson page. Can you find that same thing in the chart? Right? That's building that topographical understanding of where things are. Or it might be that you have a student who just is devouring math, and you might say, okay, well, go look at those charts and pick something that you want to know more about, right? And you may use some of the math map resources, you may use some of the content that's in the companion, or you may go and look elsewhere, right? So you might have a student who goes, oh, like I'm really interested in this thing called the jerk. I go know more. The jerk. What is that? Right. And so maybe they go and they start researching the jerk, and then they get it really into roller coaster, right? The physics of roller coasters and how does the derivative relate to that? So this may be a jumping off point for those students who are like, okay, yeah, I'm happy to practice this stuff, but I want more. This is a jumping off point that might give them some places where they want to jump off and go and investigate. So again, I know I keep saying this because a lot of people look at the charts and they go, oh, this is overwhelming. This is a 13-year goal, right? To become familiar for those students who are starting now and in the next couple of years, right? Since we're not going to have that full rollout, right? It's a 6-year goal to become familiar with the charts. And again, it's a familiarity, not a mastery. And so parents can choose to use these as a resource at home, that right, as to for themselves to see where what they're studying fits into the bigger whole, as grammar, as memory work, as a resource. If it's just really overwhelming, don't stress about it the first year. And yes.
How stable are these charts? Or do you feel like they're pretty complete and comprehensive, or do you feel like there's going to be some edits along the way in future years?
I think that they're pretty stable. So, for example, in lesson 12, I'll just let you know because this is a change I made yesterday. They are really pretty stable. Sometimes we might look at something and go, "Oh, I could have explained that better." So, for example, yesterday, in chart 12.4, we talk about correspondence, similarity, and congruence. And I added this sentence. I said that corresponding, similar, and congruent all assume the same shaped figure. For example, segment, segment, n-gon, n-gon, circle, circle, etc. Right? So it clarified what we were talking about. That information was already there. I just hadn't written it as that sentence. So I edited it to clarification. So those are, and that's probably one of the biggest changes that I've made. Usually they're fairly small. For example, you know, if a minus sign wasn't clear, Lee might be like, make this bigger. And so I'll make a minus sign bigger. We have found 2 or 3 math errors. They were relatively minor, but we've corrected those. So but the at this point, I think is pretty stable. And one of the great things about having a fresh set with each time you purchase the curriculum is that you can write on it, right? You can use this as a resource. It's not, you know, it's not a book that, oh, don't write in the book, right? You can write on this, you can highlight it. Each of your kids can have a set. And so you can make these charts really work for you, just like the rest of the curriculum does. Right. Well, just to remind you of our release schedule and the way that we're working, again, you have access through the companion to the digits, the naturals, and the fractions, and then the complex is printed this year. Next year, you'll have access to all of the levels, either in print or digitally. So that's a year from now when they will be available. And so if anybody has questions about where to start, if you want to dive in with those digital lessons, let me know. We can certainly address that. I do want to make sure everybody is aware that next week the switch gets flipped from the 23-24 year to the 24-25 year, which means that if you currently are not fully enrolled for 5, your access in CC Connected will be limited to the first 6 weeks. Because of the way the companion is designed, it's sort of an all or nothing. And so you will not have access to the companion until you have been marked as a member by your director. So if you have been enjoying the companion and want to have uninterrupted access over the summer, all you need to do is make sure your tuition is paid and your director has marked you as a member for the 24-25 year. So we just want to make sure everybody understands. And again, the companion is where you can access the digits, the naturals, and the fractions digital lesson pages. Does anybody have any questions about that?
I was wondering if you, oh, never mind. She already answered in the comments.
Yeah.
Sorry, thanks.
Well, Nicole also had asked, and I want to make sure that you agreed with me. If a parent is looking through the material and they see some words that they don't, definitely necessarily understand the definitions, and they go look in the glossary and they are still struggling, is it okay to bring those kind of questions to the book club call?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Please do. Because when you guys ask questions, especially if you're like, hey, I looked in the companion and this made it worse. I'm the one that's like editing that and creating that content. So if I wrote a definition that wasn't helpful way that I can make it better, I want to know that so that we can, right? The beauty of a digital is that we can constantly update it. But also, even if it's something you're like, you don't need to update it, I just need an explanation. A lot of times there are things that are explained, words and images it's hard to communicate in a static resource like the glossary. So yes, any question you have, please feel free to bring it to the book club. And speaking of those resources, just to remind you that that companion is has a lot of information in it. It has some material like the who, what, why, when, where, and how of the math map. It has ideas for how to tailor the curriculum at home. It has access to the glossary and the travel log. Once you go into the booklets, and I will clarify that right now, the booklets that you can enter into are the complex booklets, but the content in the complex booklets is going to be the same. What you see there for the charts, no matter what domain you're in. So you might be working through the fractions, but you want to look at something in the charts. You can still go into that complex booklet in the same lesson and find that content and get help. So the charts have content. So for those of you that are like, I just want to understand what a limit is, you can go in and charts and see where I've explained more about limits and get more background information there. For those of you that are in the complex booklets, we actually do the problems on the top 1 through 4. So you can click on the problem and actually watch a little video that works through that. So there's a lot of content that is in that complex, those complex booklets on CC Connected that will still be helpful even if you're working through a different domain.
Is there a specific rollout date for each of the different, like 9, 10, 11, 12? Because this only goes up to 8 right now.
Yeah, so they're, because we are still creating this resource, they're going to be roughly every 2 weeks. We'll be rolling out additional weeks. So by the time the academic year starts, there'll be, probably the first 10, 11 lessons will be available, connected, and then every 2 weeks So we'll stay ahead of where any community is in terms of getting that content out. And then next year we'll be releasing levels on the companion. As we release the print versions, you'll see those versions released on in the companion also. Are there other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So I was just talking with one of my moms. I'm going to be tutoring challenge 4 this coming up year. She's a math mom, but she had a question on the page 7 of the ex nihilo lesson, or yes, I don't know. It's really simple. It's more, the instructions are circle the index in each equation. And so we were to circle the power of 0 and one of them, and it said, or any other number, and she didn't understand why that was there. It's page 7 in the middle column in the roots.
So yeah, so that for math people, yes, that is a question that's come up a couple of times. So that example is included just to help show the pattern, because one of the things that we want to do in lessons, we really are emphasizing the of the power relationship. And so when we with an index and that equals a power, that we can rearrange those parts when whether we're looking for the power, the base, or the index, and that's where we're using exponentiation. And so the 0, 1 is what we call an indeterminate case, because any power to anything to the 0th power, right? It's one of those weird things that if I have 0 3s, right, any number to the 0 power, well, and I should not use that, but the 0th power is 1. So it's just there to show the relationship. It's not really there to show a mathematical truth necessarily. It's just to practice where those pieces would fit. So I know that it makes some math people sort of grit their teeth, because they're like, well, that's not necessarily true, but we're just trying to help point out the pattern there. So yeah.
She is not a person.
Yeah, Lee is very big on pattern and wanting to emphasize pattern looks like, not necessarily the computation. And so that's what she's getting at there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So we also have, in addition to the companion, which is a static resource that you can go and use at any point in time, we also have the forums, and those are moderated by Babs and Shauna, and they do just an amazing job. I don't know that there are very many questions that they have not been able to answer. So that's a great place to go and enter into that conversation that spans your community. Here's another place where we see the beauty of the math map in unifying all of our communities. And we see that on the forums, that within a couple of weeks, right, all of our communities are discussing the same math concept, no matter whether we're talking about foundations, essentials, challenge, everybody can be talking about that same math concept. And so in CC Connected, we have forums for Challenge A parents, Foundations parents, Essentials parents, and then certainly our tutors. And those are being moderated by Babs and Shauna. So there's another resource for you to ask questions or join that conversation. You're all here at the book club, but I do like to let everybody know that we now have an archive where we have the first round of our book club. We spend a lot of time really on the exordium. So if you're kind of like, what does this conversation look like? And you're looking for a model of what that conversation could be, of what kinds of things people might bring up when they're talking about the art. That first round of the book club is a great resource. Our second round of the book club went specifically through the naturals lessons and looking at those concepts from the naturals lessons perspective. So if you're like, what are some questions I could ask, especially if you're using those naturals with your older students and you're looking to make it a little bit more than just tracing, that second round of the book club is really helpful. And then this first dimensional view for the summer has been some of the really big questions that we've had. So those are some resources that are available and can be accessed either through leebortons.com or through YouTube. Obviously, I love it when I hear people say, you know, this other mom or my tutor, right? We were working together, because now we really can do that. So working together is a great way to learn and grow. And then you also have access to the math map at classicalconversations.com. So lots of ways that we can support you that were not previously available. And so we really want everybody to feel supported and have opportunities to ask their questions. So that's what I have today. And I probably talked more and should have like been quiet more and give you guys more time to chat. But please, we have not much time, but if there's lingering questions, please go ahead and ask.
Kirsty, this might not be the place for this, but somebody had a question. I was going to try to find it out if you don't know. If you're a challenge 4 director, like if you're a challenge B through 4, would you have access to the forums where we have like parents of foundations and essentials, or is it tied to your CC
I
Connect?
don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. So I told her I would try to find out for her.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You do have access, you know, you can always email the mathmap@cc.com if you don't have access to those forums. And you do have access to the Math Map companion. All right. Well, I'm excited. Next week, we are going to be in ND, and we're going to answer another big question. We're going to take a look at the Ex Nihilo booklet and the Seeing the Unseen booklet and talk about how they sort of bookend your year and work together in helping us to achieve that goal of knowing God and making him known through math. So I look forward to seeing you all then.